Welcome to the garment industry call to action session this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Rangarajan, and I represent the ILO, which is the neutral convener and host of the call to action. I pass it to my fellow panelists to also introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Christina Clausen from Industrial Global Union. I'm the director for the textile, garment, leather, and shoe sector, and we are an endorsee of the call to action.
Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Levine. I head sustainability at Under Armour Incorporated. We're headquartered in the United States, and we are from the brand stakeholder group of call to action endorsees.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today to discuss the global call to action. What I'm going to do is just start with a very brief overview of what the call to action is. And I don't need to spend a lot of time explaining the garment industry to you. You're all experts and you've been at this larger conference, but I did just want to highlight the importance of the garment industry to the economic and social livelihoods of more than 60 million workers worldwide who rely on the garment industry. The majority of them are women, and a large percentage also migrant workers. And for many of workers, this is their first time that they're coming into the formal sector, so really presents the first opportunity for them to earn a stable income for their families. And what we saw happen when COVID hit was widespread closures, layoffs, furloughs, failure to pay wages. It was really an unmitigated disaster. And this was compounded by the fact that many of the countries where garments are made have a very weak social protection system. So no social insurance, unemployment insurance, lack of medical benefits. So workers were falling through the cracks and really with no way to respond, with the very severe risk of of falling into extreme poverty and reversing so many of the gains that have been made. So in the latter part of March and April, the ILO, together with workers' organizations, employers' organizations, governments, manufacturers, all came together and said, we need a coordinated response. The only way to truly address this crisis is by coming together and seeing how do we protect workers, incomes, health, how do we ensure that factories can stay open, and how do we start to protect workers through looking at the social protection systems and the social safety nets that we need in their countries where they live. So at this point, we have about 125, 130 endorsees. The effort is overseen by the International Organization of Employers, the International Trade Union Federation, and Industrial, and again, under the coordination and neutral convening of the International Labor Organization. I'm not going to go through the details of the long and complicated text that was negotiated by all of these actors. You can imagine what went into deciding on each and every word. I'll let you go onto our website, on the ILO website, to find out more. But there was really 5 areas of commitments. One is about trying to harness financial resources to help address the immediate crisis. So international financial institutions, government donors to say, how can we accelerate access to credit? How can we help with immediate income support, with low interest loans, and other types of support? So that's the first bucket of commitments. The second is about ensuring that those funds could be channeled to manufacturers and could be used for payment of wages, all the while respecting ILO core labor standards and ensuring health and safety were respected. As I mentioned before, highlighting the importance of building stronger social safety nets in the countries where garments are produced. And finally, brands committed to paying for all orders that were either finished or in production, to ensuring open lines of communications with their supplier partners, and when financial circumstances permit, to helping to support their factories where possible. And in order to turn this from a global set of commitments into real action on the ground, the effort selected 8 priority countries. based on their dependence on the apparel industry, based on the liquidity needs of the business community, the risk of workers, and the relative strength of their social protection system. So you can see here the list of countries, and this is really where we've been focusing on our efforts in the past few months, is supporting national processes. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it to my fellow panelists, starting with Christina, to have a direct conversation with Michael about how we've moved this forward.
Thanks, Tara. And I think you gave a very detailed report on an overview of what the call to action is. So I guess for Michael, my question that I have for you as an endorsee, what made you endorse the call to action? Why was that important for your brand?
Thanks, Christina. So I think as we looked at the first quarter of 2020, brands saw and then felt the emergent spread and impacts of a devastating, fast-spreading global pandemic. As people became sick and fell victims to COVID-19, so too did the economies and business they powered and in which they worked. And as Tara has explained, the damage extended well beyond the formal sectors, such as garment and apparel and footwear, to informal sectors. The majority of people or workers at the center of this are women, also members of IPOC community. Businesses closed, demand for products dramatically fell or dropped off completely. Some brands, household names, are not here anymore. And for many brands that remain, they've lost many valued team members to the economic consequences. So in a crisis, there are different options for companies. You could turn inward and just focus on controlling damage, just look at individual survival. But I think the brands and the other call to action endorsees chose to step off the sidelines and act, recognizing that unprecedented times require unprecedented global partnerships. There was a need for tripartite expertise, deep knowledge and experience globally and locally in labor markets and economies. So we turned to the ILO. I want to start, and I'm sure I'll forget many, by thanking contributors and parts of the call to action. First, Guy Ryder, Dan Reese, Rupa and Utara, and the Social Protection Bureau of the ILO. Thanks as well to Sharon Burrows and Allison Tate of ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation. Thanks to you, Christina, and previously to Jenny Holcroft of Industrial. And last but no way least, to the IOE, International Organization of Employers, including Roberto Suarez Santos, and in particular to the hard work leadership of Matthias Torns and Matthias Espinosa. Turning back to the call to action, we are seeking to pull together rather than watch things fall apart. We're trying to rise rather than fall together, and to build back better and investing smarter by first acknowledging that without personal health, there can't be economic or business health. And then we're evaluating the needs of workers and businesses that employ and depend on them, to identify the roles of and needed actions from governments, IFIs and donors, businesses, trade unions, so that we can work together to strengthen social protection systems, and then in turn support sustainable and resilient value chains. We're working together to just wrapping up.
Go ahead.
We're working together though to address major structural issues that existed before and were laid bare by the pandemic. And I think we know that structural and systemic change will take time. Just one last point. I think we recognize in the call to action that progress has been slower, maybe is occurring at different speeds, in phases, times, and perhaps in ways that are different from what we envisioned. And I'm not a quoter, but here I think of James Baldwin's call to action, which was that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed that's not faced. So in short, in the call to action, we're facing this, we're acting to be in service of the change that's needed. Sorry about the lengthy intro, Christina.
No. I just wanted to grab onto one point that you had made. So the idea about how to do this jointly together and to come under the auspices of the ILO. I think for labor, that was very key. When we saw the pandemic, these unprecedented impacts on the sector, and we really saw workers in the sector suffering and the need for income support. Specifically for us as trade unions, it was very important that we have a clear way to mitigate the impact together and move the industry forward. Because I think some points that you mentioned, especially about the fragility that we saw within the supply chain, is really true. It's still, we've seen that We knew as trade unions that the supply chain was fragile. We didn't have mechanisms in place to deal with many of the impacts that we've just seen, right? So what Tara mentioned, that workers could very quickly slide into poverty, and we still have a big concern around that. But I do know that you've been heading as part of the international working group. You've been point on collectively, but you specifically have been point on the financial institutions, how we've approached financial institutions. So maybe you could just give us a little bit of background on what we've been doing to secure funds and what still needs to be done.
Sure. Thank you, Christina. I was supposed to ask you the question, but you were so adroit that you just answered the question before I got to it. So thank you. So the two principal groups to which the call to action has worked is through the working group, which you mentioned, but there's also what's called the IFI task force, which roughly has 5 team members. Again, it's the ILO, Alison Tate of ITIC, you now from Industrial, Matthias Norens of IOE, and I represent brands in this regard. What we've done is engage with international financial institutions and donors. First, we had to identify which ones to go to, and these included the IMF and World Bank, among others. Then we had to reach out, communicate with them, and set up meetings. And what we learned through these meetings, which were attended by very strong and deep representation from these organizations, is their expertise in addressing developmental economic challenges. We learned, for example, that they already had tools in place through which in this crisis they had lent on the order of billions, if not millions of dollars, which are sent to countries at the country level. And importantly, we learned that the funds go to countries, not to particular sectors. So the next step was to find some common ground, to identify some areas where we can partner with these institutions to work at the national level. And I think we're also looking at working with them as they extend future loans or continue to suspend debt service, at whether we can attach some conditions to support the strengthening of social protection system. So to clearly not only build back better, but to invest smarter. And I think that was a big learning, that we have to go to the national level. And I wanted to turn to you, Christina, to ask you if you could explain to our audience how the call to actions work has occurred at the national level, what the focus has been, what your experience has been.
Yeah, thanks. That the national level is really where this has to happen. I mean, we have these broad priorities and principles, but how do you then implement them? And that's really on a national level. So we've convened in different ways, right? Every country is different. The stakeholders there have different ways of interacting. So we've kind of used the ILO as the neutral convener in some cases, and in other cases, for example, in Pakistan and India, we did kind of bilateral prep meetings with the employers and the trade unions on the call to action, how we can set a task force team there. So there's still like a lot of work to be done on the country level, and we're still, and as you mentioned in the part about the funds, we're still looking for those funds. And I think what's been very important is the ILO has done a really good job in dedicating the information, like their technical assistance, to figure out how these funds have come into the country, where they are, what have they been dedicated for, and can some of them be repurposed for this sectoral approach? Because as you mentioned, it is not the donors organizations like the IFIs give to the country, they don't give to the sector. So I think what we're trying to do through the call to action is unique in that sense. But from a trade union perspective and from Industrial's perspective, what's been very key for us has been the sectoral approach, right? We need as trade unions to have a sectoral approach together with employers, our counterpart, the suppliers. And I think especially in this sector, there's a role for brands to play in this industrial relations call it supply chain industrial relations. So I think that's the implementation that's happening. I agree with you. Could it be faster? Yes, because we've just had another shutdown in Myanmar, for example, right? The factories have closed. So we're not out of the pandemic, and we're still really struggling for that access to funds. But I would say what's important also to mention from trade unions is that we know that the need for social protection is there. That is a key for us, and I think it's very important that the brands and the endorsees of the call to action have identified that as a long-term goal for the industry, because without that, it's going to be very hard if we have other pandemics or other incidences that happen, right? So without that strong social protection floor, it'll be difficult for garment workers. So I think that us dedicating ourselves to do it is an important step forward.
Great. Well, maybe we should jump into some of the questions that we've got coming in. We have a lot of questions coming from participants who are listening in. I'm going to read one of them. You know, there's a range of questions on a very similar topic. And that is for you to comment on call for brands to pay workers. Not only are the poverty wages garments earn not sustainable, but they're now owed billions in wages. Will brands be pushed to commit to wage assurance? There's, I'd say, a whole number of questions that have been asked about whether or not brands can commit to wage assurance. So I think those are over to you, Michael.
Yeah, I think the answer is that the call to action is pretty clear on this. What brands have committed to is to honor their commitments to pay for orders completed and in production. Brands have also been hit very dramatically by the economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. Demand fell off, orders were canceled to brands, and that in turn, the lack of demand is passed back through the value chain. Brands are laying off people, they're retrenching, they're furloughing people, brands have gone out of business. So in short, what brands are doing are trying to work through this mechanism, working to contact the IFIs and donors to identify whether there are additional funds. There may be some brands that have foundations or other capacities to take additional steps, but in general, brands are suffering from the economic crisis acutely, and they're not in a position to make additional contributions. They're simply, in many cases, fighting for survival and to get back to some sort of normalcy, fighting, as Christina pointed out, through some of the shutdowns that would then reemerge after businesses have reopened.
But Michael, I just want to add that I think there is some space open within the way the call to action discusses the financing, is that brands and retailers, you know, as Tara mentioned in her overview, can commit to give direct support to factories. So that space is still open. It's, you know, the more money we can get into the system, the better it's going to be for workers. So, I mean, coming from the trade union perspective, we hope that we are able to ensure that workers who were impacted by the shutdowns and, you know, wage reductions and layoffs have a way to make it through the pandemic and come out. And, you know, we as trade unions want the suppliers to survive, right? They're our direct employers. We need an active manufacturing industry to continue in the production countries. And for us as trade unions, that's really important that the funds are there.
Great. I'm going to move on to another question. Someone is asking if there's a plan to ensure that workers beyond the priority countries are covered, and what support to non-priority countries would look like. Do you want to start with that one, Christina?
Yeah, Tara, maybe you can help me out, because I think what we have decided within the international working group is that countries can come and ask to become part of the call to action. So if the tripartite business, trade unions, and employers want to come to the call to action and say, for example, in Sri Lanka, this is something we would like to be engage in as well. I think we have the structure and the capacity to do that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, even if a country does not come in as a formal, you know, initial country, the call to action can provide approach and tools and advice to help support the initiative in other countries. let's see, a number of other questions are coming in. As a result of COVID, do you anticipate that manufacturing will shift away from countries such as Bangladesh and Cambodia, as fashion brands may want to work with suppliers closer to their markets? Why don't we start with you on that one, Michael?
I think that brands look at global value chains and they find value propositions in different countries. So I think though brands source from different countries, there's still a continued interest in supporting the businesses and suppliers in those countries by placing orders as the demand restores. So I think brands will look at the value proposition, the quality of the products, the pace at which they can be delivered, the capacity for innovation, among other factors in choosing who their suppliers are. And there are strategies which do look at producing products closer to the markets in which they're to be sold. That also serves some important sustainability concerns, like reducing environmental impact. But in general, I think brands are looking to help support a just and resilient value chain by participating in the call to action and to take these actions in support of business partners throughout that value chain.
Perfect. And thank you for that, Michael. And here's one for you, Christina. We're talking a lot about brands having to commit to paying living wages. How about garment manufacturers? Can we ask them to commit to pay living wages?
So that's a little bit outside of the call to action priorities, but I'll just let you know that from Industrial, our main focus is to institute sectoral bargaining, where that happens on an industry-wide level with the suppliers. So we need to have that. We see that the low wages is a systemic problem in the industry. And to do that, we need to have collective bargaining on a sectoral basis. Now, we have work that we're doing with some brands under action, collaboration, and transformation, and you can look at the website and you'll see how brands are pooling their leverage to make changes in their purchasing practices, but that is not part of the call to action. That's work that we're doing with brands who want to commit, sign an agreement with Industrial and its affiliates to work towards sectoral bargaining in production countries. And I would have to say, when I look at the world and where we are, countries that had that system in place, for example, South Africa, they were very quickly able to meet with their employer counterparts and set the framework to how COVID's going to impact how workers are going to be paid. When we see countries that don't have that, it's a pandemic, it's a tragedy, and it's the fragility of the supply chain.
Thank you so much, Christina. Really want to thank you for your participation and also yours, Michael. For any other information on the call to action, please go again to the ILO website and search Global Garment Industry Call to Action. You can find more information there and certainly contact information for any of us for more questions. So I appreciate all the questions from the participants. Again, to Christina and Michael, it's been a pleasure being here with you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Tara. Great to be here with you as well. And thanks for your partnership in this work.
Thanks for all the questions from the participants as well.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.